Dead America, Lowcountry, Part 5. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. "Morning, Princess," Troy drawled as Grace stretched, groaning as her back crackled. She wasn't quite awake enough to level him with a proper glare, so instead she twisted back and forth, relishing in the crackles of her spine. A ragged yawn overtook her, and she rubbed her eyes. "Needs a sleep after yesterday's badassery," Hawk said, his deep voice echoing through the cells. "I'll be honest, girl, I didn't think you'd be so good at this." She wrinkled her nose and pulled out her saggy ponytail. "Killing zombies?" she asked dryly. "Or trying to survive under threat of getting eaten or killed by a group of insane assholes?" Hawk chuckled, shaking his head. "All of the above," he admitted. "No offense, but you don't look like much in a fight at first glance." "You know, when somebody starts a sentence with 'no offense,' it's usually offensive," she said as she wound her unruly hair back up into a messy bun. He shook his head. "Just being honest," he said. "I mean, granted, you survived this long, but seeing you in action yesterday was surprising." "Can't say the same about the others they had with us," Eddie muttered, stretching his lean frame down to touch his toes. He was a stark contrast to Hawk, who was a beast of a man. But despite his wiry body, he was ruthless out in the field. "Yeah," Troy agreed, shaking his head as he lounged back on his bed. "Those poor suckers didn't know what hit 'em. It was almost more of a liability having to deal with them than an asset having extra bodies to help out." Grace sighed. "They're fucked either way," she mused. "Either they're useful and they try to help and die, or they refuse and QXR kills them." "What else are any of us supposed to do?" Troy asked, though he wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. "We have to do as they say, with who they say." She grabbed a water bottle from beside her bed from the night before and took a long swig. Troy shrugged. "At least we've got a warm bed and food and drink," he amended. "I'd rather have to find that shit myself and be free," she replied. "We'd be fighting zombies either way," he said. She shook her head. "On our terms, though. Everything we do right now isn't for us. It's so that QXR can solidify their own position of power." "What do you think they'll do with us once the island is clear?" Hawk asked, and the insinuation hung in the air. Grace took another long swig and swallowed slowly. "I don't think we have to worry about that anytime soon," she replied. "Seems like the clearing is endless." "Except it's not endless," Eddie cut in as he stretched to the side. "It's going to run out. You think they'll carve out a little community for us to just chill in?" Troy snorted. "Not likely," he said, and crossed his feet at the ankles, making the most of their relaxed time. "Though I don't think we'll be useless. There'll be floors to sweep and dishes to do." "I guess it's better than being shot," Hawk muttered. Eddie rolled his eyes as he twisted his torso back and forth, hopping from foot to foot. "Not by much," he retorted. "But the fact still stands that we need to make sure that we're as useful to them as we can be. It's not like this is going to be a vacation spot for us once all the zombies are cleared out." Grace leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees. "Maybe for them." "Rise and shine, pissants," Mosley declared as he descended the steps to their cell block, clapping his hands loudly. "Oh, you're already awake. Such exciting puppies, ready for their next playdate." Grace clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to glare at him. How she hated this man. "Get some good rest?" he asked with a sneer. "What about you, city boy?" He tapped on the bars to Troy's cell and clicked his tongue. "Accommodations up to snuff for you?" "Oh yeah, 5 stars," the New Yorker drawled, not sitting up. Mosley glanced over the crew, making sure they were paying attention. "You fuckers get to go clear the mall today," he said brightly, spreading his arms. When there was no response, he looked back and forth, eyebrows raising. What? No cheers? You should be fucking ecstatic that you get to go out and do this instead of taking a bullet to the head, no? We're already doing all your grunt work, Eddie declared, leaning on the bars. Is it a requirement to be happy about it too? Gratitude would be nice, Mosley snapped, narrowing his eyes. I could kill all of you. Grace finally looked up at him, feigning surprise and putting a hand to her chest. But then, who would do all your dirty work? She asked, fluttering her eyelashes. You're clearly incapable of doing it yourself. Bitch, I have no problem showing you exactly what I'm capable of doing, he growled, drawing his lower lip between his teeth. She forced herself not to wither under his leer, but her skin crawled at the insinuation. If he made a move on her, she knew she could probably hold her own in fighting him off, but that would likely mean death. But the other option, just laying down and taking it, was just not an option. What do you say, huh? He asked, voice sickly sweet. You need me to show you what real dirty work is like? Go fuck yourself, she snapped. He growled, taking a step towards her cell. That's enough, No Name declared, entering the hallway from the stairwell. He carried a tray of steaming bowls and set it down on a small table next to the door. Mosley scowled at him, eyes narrowing. I'm busy, he snapped. So am I, No Name replied, crossing his arms and straightening his broad shoulders. These four have a big job today, and I need to get them to it, so get lost. Mosley snarled, stalking up to him. You don't get to tell me what to do, he said petulantly. But there was a hint of a quiver in his voice. No Name glared down at him. You want to put your fists behind that? The shorter man shriveled and threw a glance back at Grace before heading up the stairs in a huff. No Name shook his head with disgust, and then began doling out the bowls, shoving them one by one into the cells. I'd say thank you for getting rid of that creep, Grace said dryly as she picked up her bowl. But you're also keeping me in a cell and forcing labor, so not exactly much to be thankful for. He didn't respond, simply finished handing out breakfast, which turned out to be bowls of scrambled eggs and ground meat. No hot sauce? Hawk muttered. Terrorists. He scooped a forkful into his mouth. Today's target is the mall, No Name announced once everyone was eating, leaning against the wall and crossing his arms. It was an impromptu rescue shelter when everything started to go to shit. We were able to lock it up tight day one, but it's full to the brim. Eddie raised an eyebrow. A mall? Full to the brim? He shook his head. How the hell are we going to deal with that? He asked, flabbergasted. That'll be for you to figure out, No Name replied. It's going to be a major operation, and you'll have to get a lay of the land. You'll be going in with 4 other civilians. Wait, only 8 of us for the whole mall? Troy exclaimed. No backup from your trigger-happy mercenary buddies? Hawk and Eddie both opened their mouths, and No Name raised his hands. I know, he said loudly to shut them up. I know. If it were up to me, I'd be going in there too. This is too big, but orders are orders, and orders are to send the 8 of you in to do this. Why? Grace demanded. I get that we're expendable to you assholes, but this is just inefficient for your time frame. No Name shrugged, shaking his shoulders. I don't know. I just get my orders. Woof, woof, Hawk muttered. Follow blindly, little doggy. Their captor glared at him, but had no rebuttal. Eat your breakfast, he said. We're moving out in 5. Chapter 2. Grace sat in the passenger seat as No Name drove them out to the mall, the men in the back. She stared out the window, but didn't really see the landscape passing her by. Her time in the cell was spent thinking of her brother, hoping he was okay. torn between wanting him to mount some kind of rescue and wanting him to just stay away, stay safe. There was no way out of this for her, or at least it didn't feel like it in the near future. She would do everything she could to survive, and that was all she could do. There was no real standing up to these men. At least if she was really good at what they were sending her to do, she could prove useful for after. After? What came after? These thoughts plagued her in her cell as well, in the quiet, when she struggled to sleep. Her body was exhausted after missions, but her mind reeled. These days were nothing but determination and fear and survival. The nights, terrible simply for not knowing what the next would bring. She spotted a line of civilians being offloaded into a processing area, and her gaze perked up, focusing on the here and now. "Where did they come from?" she asked. No Name glanced over. "We've been finding quite a few survivors in Bluffton. They're transporting them all here."
"What happens to them all?"
Hawk piped up from the back seat.
"The ones who don't get sent off to die, clearing out zombies."
No Name shook his head, and Grace noticed the tight line of his jaw, as if he were reluctant to answer. He didn't say anything, and that was answer enough. She studied him as he drove, glaring daggers into the side of his head. She wasn't naive enough to think that she could gain his sympathy, but there was definitely something about him that was different from the others. He didn't seem to take pleasure in tormenting them. He didn't seem to take pleasure in really anything he was doing to them. And by the tense muscles in his upper body at Hawk's question, she didn't think he took much pleasure in the whole slavery thing. But he was still doing his job, still following orders, and that meant he was not her friend, and likely never would be. If he cared about the civilians more than his own livelihood, then he would have done something about it before now, instead of just falling in line.
"Woof woof,"
Hawk had said. Woof woof indeed, Grace thought bitterly, and turned back to the window. They reached the mall, seeing several mercenaries standing guard around it and on top of it. She assumed that it was to make sure that the ghouls didn't figure out how to escape. It boiled her guts to think that they were allowed to just stand outside in the safety, while sending untrained civilians inside to do their dirty work. No Name pulled up near the front entrance, and a mercenary approached, slinging his gun over his shoulder as they all piled out of the van. "I've done some recon on the roof," he said, pulling a sheet of paper from his pocket and unfolding it. He held it out so they could all see as they clustered around. "There's hundreds of those things in there, but the majority of them are in the big department store here." He pointed to the giant square on the far side of his crudely drawn map. Grace pursed her lips. "What are the chances it's sealed off from the rest of the mall?" she asked. The mercenary shook his head. "It's not," he replied. "The main floor is closed, but the second floor doors are open. They must have been opening those for employees to get in when everything went to shit. If you want to stand even a slim chance of surviving this, you're going to have to get those doors closed," No Name said. Grace glared daggers at him. No shit, she thought, but held her tongue. She took the map and studied it. Crude as it was fairly detailed, with all of the entrances marked clearly. "There's a service entrance on the first floor that seems to stay pretty quiet, so you can get in safely," the mercenary said, pointing to one of the marked entrances. "You should be able to fight your way up to the second floor easily from there, with that escalator. Once the doors are shut and you thin out some of the horde, you're to make a call to No Name here so we can take out the rest of those things." Grace pursed her lips in thought. "What's this big store here?" she asked, pointing to one just beside the department store doors. "It's a sporting goods store," the mercenary explained. She nodded. "Probably our best bet is to get up there, close the doors, and then hide out in there for a few minutes to take the heat off of our initial run, and get a lay of the land," she suggested. "Are you going to be coming in after us?" Troy asked, crossing his arms. "Once the main mall is clear, your job will be to bang on the doors to draw those things in the department store towards the access panels above," the mercenary said. "We'll kill them all from above." Grace continued staring at the map and then looked up as No Name held a walkie-talkie in front of her face. "Call me when you're ready," he said gruffly. She snatched it out of his hand and shoved it into her back pocket. "Not if we're in trouble?" she asked dryly. "Guess there's nobody coming in to help us if we get cornered, huh?" He shook his head, not meeting her gaze. Another van pulled up and the sliding door opened, 4 civilians reluctantly getting out.
"Oh, fuck no,"
Hawk muttered at the sight of Aaron, a middle-aged man that had nearly gotten them killed the day before.
"No way we're taking him in with us."
Aaron scowled at him as they approached. "I don't want to go in there any more than you do," he snapped.
"You should stay out here then, since you can't follow directions and you only care about your own ass,"
Hawk shot back. No Name held up his hands. "The 8 of you are going in. You need all the hands you can get." He reached into his holster and grabbed his handgun, holding it out to Grace. "She's in charge. Listen to her if you want to live through this." "No pressure," she muttered, and shoved the gun in the back of her pants. The weight of it was like a ton of bricks. 8. 8 of them to get through this. She took a deep breath. "I think our best bet is to split into groups. 1 group to cause a diversion, 1 to secure the sporting goods store, and 1 to get those doors closed." The mercenary returned with a plastic bin full of melee weapons, crowbars and tire irons and the like. "How come she gets a gun?" one of the new civilians whined. Grace took a deep breath. "Because I'm getting us through this if you listen to me," she said firmly. "This isn't my first rodeo here, and if you complain too much, these guys will shoot you. So stay focused." Her speech had the intended effect, and the group stood there, staring at her expectantly, clutching their weapons. "You and you, what are your names?" she asked, pointing at 2 of the newcomers. "I'm Allie, and this is Joseph," a middle-aged woman said. They both looked like they hadn't seen a lot of action in their lives, but at least seemed in good enough shape to run and swing a crowbar. Joseph's forehead shone with a thick sheen of sweat, fear written all over his face. But who wasn't afraid these days? "Okay, you and Hawk are with me," Grace continued. "We're going to secure the doors. Then we'll need 2 groups of 2, 1 to cause a distraction to clear the area, and another to clear the sporting goods store so we have a safe place to regroup." "I'll take the distraction team," Eddie said, raising his hand. Troy glanced at Grace, and she shot him a knowing look, hoping he understood that she wanted a person she trusted on each team. "Yeah, I'll do the sporting goods store," he said with a sigh, and smacked Aaron on the shoulder. "You ready for a proper mission? Following orders?" The older man glowered at him, but nodded, gripping his crowbar tightly. "Guess you're with me," Eddie said brightly, turning to the final man, a wiry guy that looked like he'd sat in front of a computer his whole life. "What's your name?" "Leo," he said, taking a deep breath. "You?" "Eddie," came the reply, and they shook hands. Grace nodded and pointed to a section of the map. "We'll have to get a lay of the land once we're in there, and think on our feet," she said. "But I'm thinking probably over here would be a good place to make a ruckus. It's far enough that it shouldn't draw too many from the department store, but enough to thin it out a bit where we're working." Eddie nodded. "You got it." "We'll go up the escalator as a group, and then split up at the top to do our jobs," she continued, looking around the group. "That makes sense?" There were nods all around, and then she turned to No Name. "I guess that means we're ready. Are we free to go, or does somebody need to intimidate us first?" He pressed his lips into a thin line and shook his head, not saying a word. Grace took a deep breath and folded up the paper, shoving it into the pocket of her jeans. She grabbed a crowbar from the bin and gripped it tightly. "Okay, let's go." Chapter 3. Grace reached the service entrance and motioned for Troy to come forward as she stepped to the side with her crowbar raised. "Open it just a little, and then be ready in case there's pushback." He nodded, and Hawk sidled up next to him to help brace the door. Troy took a deep breath and then turned the handle. pressing his shoulder against the door and inching it open. He grunted as a body slammed into the door, a bloody arm flailing out of the gap. Grace took her time lining up her jab as Troy and Hawk had a fairly good brace on the door. When she managed to get a good look at a snarling face, she lunged forward, avoiding the arm to stab the creature in the head. The corpse fell, the rotted limb still hanging out of the bottom of the door, and Troy waited a moment before pulling it a little further. Footfalls echoed in the hallway, and Hawk dropped his stance, really digging in his feet as the door shuddered from the force of bodies slamming into it.
"Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!"
Joseph moaned, clutching his tire iron to his heart with white knuckles and backing up a few steps. Eddie threw himself between Hawk and Troy, the latter ducking down as a flailing arm whizzed past his face. Grace brought the crowbar down on the limb, snapping it at the elbow so that it dangled harmlessly. The upper arm continued to bob about, the corpse unperturbed that it had lost functionality of its claws. She managed to stab the zombie in the face, right through the eye socket, and it slid down a little, revealing two more scrambling to get past. "You need to open the door a bit," she said, widening her stance. "What?" Troy huffed as he struggled. "I can't reach the heads," she explained impatiently. "I need them to be able to get part way out the door." He grunted and turned to Eddie. "Let's slide back a bit, so I'm out of the swipe zone." Eddie and Hawk nodded, then moved back towards the hinges to give him room to slide. As the trio eased towards the wall, the door opened another inch, and 3 ghouls wormed their way into the opening, snarling and snapping at Grace. She timed a jab, going high and stabbing into the forehead of the top zombie. It flopped back as the other 2 writhed around, one of them snatching her arm in its dead hand. She wrenched her arm away, but the death grip on those things was intense, and she couldn't shake it. Troy stared at her, wide-eyed, and she put a foot against the brick wall to hold her flesh away from the snapping jaws. She noticed with a sour taste on her tongue that none of their other 4 teammates were coming to her aid. The doormen wouldn't be able to leave their posts. Otherwise, they'd have all the maintenance hallway monsters pouring out and overrunning them. She wrestled her crowbar into her free hand, smashing it down on the hard gripping arm as hard as she could. There was a sickening crack, but the fingers didn't let up. These things had no chill. All they wanted was to feed, and nothing but a direct blow to the brain would stop them. Allie screamed from behind her and lunged forward, swinging her tire iron hard into the gap in the door. Something crunched, and then the arm holding Grace dropped, taking her wrist with it. She pried the fingers off as Allie continued to flail away, smashing the tire iron with abandon. Grace ducked to avoid one of the backswings, and then another head shimmied through the corpses on the bottom, managing to wriggle its torso out through the widening gap. She stabbed it in the top of the head, and soon the pile of corpses was still. Allie continued to smash the zombies, despite them not moving, and Troy stepped away from the door, pushing her arm down. It was gentle, but firm at the same time, as if he were trying to avoid getting smashed himself. "Thank you," Grace said, chest heaving, as Allie backed up, eyes wide. The woman swallowed hard and nodded jerkily, quivering. Grace glanced over her shoulder at the other 3 men, still rooted to the spot. She was starting to feel like Hawk was right, and this team wasn't going to be good for them. But it wasn't like they could change it or do anything about it. She just had to hope to hell that having someone she trusted on each team would be enough to get them through this. "Ease up on the door," she said, and Eddie and Hawk leaned forward, letting it open another few inches. Grace poked her head in and strained her ears, listening for any more movement down the maintenance tunnel. She spotted the door at the end, blessedly closed, with no more bodies moving about. She grabbed the brown collar of one of the corpses and hauled it out of the way of the door. "Help me," she said, inclining her head to Troy. "I don't want to leave any doors open if I don't have to." He nodded and reached down, and between the 2 of them, they dragged all the fallen zombies from the doorway, leaving them on the asphalt. Once clear, Grace led the way into the tunnel. There was only one other door on the way to the mall proper, but it was locked tight with a warning sticker on it, likely electronics or water heaters or the like. When she reached the door leading to the mall, she and Troy sidled up next to each other, peering out into the open area. "What a shit show," Troy muttered, and her stomach sank. She agreed with him. They were looking at an open area, the broken-down escalators about 50 yards away. But there were zombies everywhere on the main floor, and they could see lots on the top-floor balcony as well. "This isn't going to be easy," she mused, and then stepped back to face the group. "Everyone take turns having a look. Make sure you get a lay of the land." The group moved up 2 by 2, all coming away from the window with concerned, pale faces. "What's the play here?" Eddie asked, voice tight. Grace took a deep breath. "Same as we said outside," she replied firmly. "We're going to fight our way across to the escalator, and then at the top, my team will go right towards the department store, along with the sporting goods store team, and the decoy team will go left. I can't see far enough that way, but you should be able to find somewhere to make enough noise and fall back somewhere safe." "Should?" Eddie replied dryly. She shrugged. "You volunteered for that job," she replied, waving a hand at him. "I know you'll be able to figure it out." "Thanks," he quipped. "But there are so many of those, Joseph stammered, pointing shakily at the door. "How are we going to get even to the escalator?" Grace took a deep breath. "They're fairly spread out, and not in bigger groups than 2 or 3. She held up a crowbar. "Your best weapon is fists and shoulders. If you can't knock them aside, barrel them over. Don't stop moving or you're dead. Don't even go for kill shots, just focus on making a path for yourself. Hawk and I will take the lead, and we'll try to move in a train, 2 by 2, with the decoy team bringing up the rear. Questions?" Allie raised her hand with the tire iron. "What if we trip or fall?" "Get back up fast," Troy replied dryly. Grace nodded. What else was she supposed to say? "Let's go," she said, and turned towards the door. Chapter 4. Grace waited until the door was clear about 10 yards on either side and inched it open, slipping through. She held it until Hawk passed it off and then darted forward, stabbing a ghoul in the face as the others bustled out into the mall. She knew she was breaking her own rule of not going for kill shots, but she was confident that she could take the time as she waited for the group to catch up. The door clicking shut and the sound of the corpse falling alerted some of the nearby ghouls to their presence, and then the chase was on. Grace and Hawk moved forward side by side, stabbing and shoving zombies as they went. Sounds of struggles and grunts echoed behind them, but she couldn't afford to look back to see how her team was faring. They had their instructions, and they had to follow them. She needed to focus on moving forward. Halfway to the escalator, a pack of 4 ghouls tore towards them, with a 5th straggling behind, a lot slower than the rest. She didn't have time to ruminate on how No Name had reported that some of the zombies were slowing down, and that if that was the case, why not just wait for them all to slow down? She and Hawk moved as one, lowering their shoulders to barrel into the first 2 ghouls to get close. They drove back the duo into their brethren, tripping them all up. Grace did glance over her shoulder this time, unsure if they should leave the ghouls here for their friends or not. Allie screamed as she kicked a zombie in the chest, and Joseph cowered behind her, waving his tire iron wildly at another. Grace grunted and knelt, stabbing efficiently at the fallen zombies. Hawk shook his head and took one out too, and then leapt up at the 5th shambling ghoul, giving it a hearty shove back into the few runners to slow their progress. Grace darted for the escalators, finally seeing a clear path, and skidded to a stop at the bottom, whipping around to defend the area until the rest of the group could catch up. Troy, Eddie, and Aaron reached her first, and they formed a perimeter around the foot of the escalators. Allie and Joseph tore over, hot on Hawk's heels, while Leo smacked down a few ghouls and sprinted to catch up. Grace turned and spotted some zombies staggering down the escalator towards them on the left side. "Stay right!" she cried, and began the charge up the stairs. The zombies weren't very steady on their feet and began to fall, all flailing limbs and snarling mouths as they tumbled down the stairs. One managed to grasp onto the center median, slowing its descent and swiping at her. She smashed down on its skull as she went by, and though she wasn't sure she killed it, at least it was out of the way. A few steps from the top, a zombie tore into view, launching itself off of the second floor towards her. She lashed out, holding her crowbar with both hands to push it back, grappling with it as she braced the bar across its putrid throat. She wrestled it to the side, trying to throw it over, but it was too strong and had the high ground. Hawk reached over her shoulder and smacked it in the head, and though he didn't drop it, it faltered enough that she was able to shove it over the side, plummeting to the first floor below. Grace took the last few steps quickly, emerging onto the second floor. She immediately dashed to the right, lowering her shoulder and barreling into a zombie right by the balcony railing. "This way, fuckers!" Eddie whooped, and his weapon echoed as he smacked it along the railing. Grace didn't look back as ghouls converged, tearing towards them from the department store. She trusted Eddie to do his job, and she needed to focus on the doors. Hawk was next to her then, swinging and smacking. It seemed easiest to shove as many as they could towards the railing, and that way the fallen bodies were out of the way. Plus, if they landed on their heads and happened to break their necks, then that was more dead corpses that wouldn't get back up again. The sporting goods store came into view, and Grace turned to Troy, who waved back at her. He tugged Aaron after him, and they moved to the left side of the corridor, knocking over a few ghouls to tear for the store. Eddie hollered some more in the distance, Leo whooping as well, though not quite as loud and proud. Grace and Hawk each grabbed an arm of a particularly thick ghoul, running like defensemen together, and slamming it into the railing, sending it toppling over to the first floor. Allie and Joseph clustered behind them. "I thought we were supposed to just run," he cried. "We gotta clear a path to the doors," Grace hissed. "Hopefully the decoy team can keep the rest away, but the ones between here and the doors won't just run past us. If you can get to the doors first, start working on them. But we gotta kill what we can." The rest of them nodded, but didn't have time to strategize any further, because 3 more ghouls tore for them from the department store. "Gotta think on our feet, remember?" Grace thought bitterly, and swung her crowbar for a mighty kill shot. Chapter 5. Troy burst into the sporting goods store, the metal chain doors only half closed. It was probable that they were either just opening the store or just trying to protect themselves with locking up when things went from bad to worse. There were 5 zombies inside, and they perked up as soon as Troy and Aaron crossed the threshold. "Get this closed!" Troy barked, banging on the metal barrier, and his partner began to struggle with it, dragging it along the track as quickly as he could. Troy sprinted across the 3 waist-high aisles of various equipment, a ghoul in each, 3 in the far end. He snatched a hockey stick from the wall display and thrust it out lengthways, attempting to use the business end to hold the oncoming ghoul at bay. Instead, it sank into the rotted corpse's chest cavity, sticking inside. Troy fought back a gag and swung the zombie back and forth, using it as a shield to bonk back its brethren. He changed tactics and began to use it as an undead battering ram, consistently shoving them back. His reasoning was to keep them busy while Aaron dealt with the other 2. But that seemed to be taking longer than he'd anticipated. He chanced glancing over his shoulder and saw Aaron just locking the metal barrier and leaping back as a bunch of zombies in the mall hallway smacked into it. He raised his weapon as if to jab it through the holes. "Leave them!" Troy barked. "There's 2 more in here!" Aaron whipped around just in time to see the 2 ghouls heading up the aisles, and he darted around to Troy's aisle, wide-eyed. "Fuck," Troy muttered under his breath. He'd misplaced his hope, but at least the guy had managed to get the barrier locked. They had to get these zombies taken care of, though, before the others came back to hunker down in the store. Aaron at least had the forethought to grab a hockey stick and huddled up behind Troy, holding it in his opposite hand to the tire iron with white knuckles. The ghouls came around the end of the aisle, about to box in the duo. "Once they get close, we're going to hop the shelves," Troy said. "Ready?" Aaron nodded, eyes wide. "Now!" Troy cried, and shoved his ghouls back before throwing himself over the shoe shelves, rolling over into the clear aisle. Aaron followed, but he was a bit slower, and one of the zombies grabbed his ankle on the way over. He screamed, swinging the hockey stick wildly, so hard that Troy had to duck, unable to get close enough to help him. The heavy shelves managed to keep the ghouls at bay for the most part, though he had to back up to avoid their grasping arms. He jumped to his feet, stabbing his trio in quick succession, and then finally lashed out to grab Aaron's flailing stick, wrenching it out of his hands. He brought it down hard on the zombie's neck, cutting into it slightly. Aaron kicked up with his free leg at the rotted arm, finally dislodging it, and Troy lunged with the crowbar, catching it in the temple with the curved end. He jerked downwards, tearing the front of the zombie's skull clean off, leaving only one ghoul to deal with. It shrieked as it clawed at him, mouth open, bloody drool flying everywhere as it gnashed its teeth together, trying to snap at him. Troy sneered at it, and then jabbed forward with the tip of the crowbar, burying it into the monster's eye socket. As it fell, he stepped back, chest heaving. He looked down at Aaron, who was still on the floor on his back, covering his face with his arms. "Thanks for the help," Troy muttered, and poked Aaron's shoulder with his shoe. "Come on, we gotta check the back and make sure it's clear." The prone man swallowed hard and got up, picking up his tire iron and following Troy to the cash counter. There was a rack of baseball bats off to the side, and Troy dropped his hockey stick to grab one of them, sliding the crowbar into his belt loop. He gave the heavy wood an experimental swing, and then approached the back room, peering through the glass window. A zombie in a striped umpire's outfit smacked into it, and Troy jumped, his muscles relaxing a bit at the fact that the door was shut tight. He reached out and gave it a push just to make sure, and then turned back to his partner. "We need to get back to the front of the store, see what's going on," he instructed, "and unlock the door if the others are coming back." He swallowed hard. When the others are coming back. He stalked to the front of the store, Aaron scurrying after him. The metal clanked and jangled as ghouls wrestled with it, their nasty fingers curled in through the holes. Troy stared at them for a moment, and then set the baseball bat against a shelf of rock climbing gear. He pulled his crowbar again and lined it up with one of the holes, waiting for the right moment to jam it through into a face. He hit his target, and one of the corpses fell. He glanced over at his reluctant partner. "That tire iron isn't going to do it," Troy said, motioning behind him. "Find something sharp and get stabbing." Aaron clenched his jaw for a moment. "Isn't the decoy team supposed to be drawing them away?" "They might be too far away now," Troy snapped, rolling his eyes. "We might as well do our part. No use sitting in here cowering when we can be thinning the herd." His partner chewed his lip, eyes wide, but looked around for something to use. Troy stabbed another one and then inclined his head towards the back. "Check behind the register. Maybe they have a box cutter or something." Aaron nodded and scurried off, not as quickly as he could have, and Troy rolled his eyes again, assuming that the man was stalling for time. Really? Of all the ways they could be fighting zombies, safely from behind a metal barrier was one of the best ways to get to do it. After stabbing 2 more ghouls, he was just about to bark at his partner to hurry up, when a loud noise echoed through the mall. It almost sounded like an electric guitar. Troy laughed as the sound of some crunchy, distorted power chords began to fill the air, and the zombies immediately dispersed, taking off towards the direction the decoy team had gone. He shook his head, smiling. Rock and roll. Chapter 6. As Eddie broke away from the group at the top of the escalator, his heart hammered even faster in his chest. There were zombies everywhere, and they were going to be on top of them fast. He hoped Leo was keeping pace with him okay, because he didn't have time to glance back over his shoulder. He tried to stay in the center to avoid getting boxed in, as most of the stores were closed up tight. He shoved through the ghouls he could, toppling those close to the railing over to the floor below. At the huffing behind him, he was comforted that Leo was keeping pace. They reached a bit of a lull, and he slammed his metal weapon down on the railing, echoing a loud clang. "This way, fuckers!" he bellowed, looking back towards the department store. There was a plethora of ghouls all over the place down there, and though Grace and Hawk were holding their own, they needed the door clear if they had any hope of getting them shut. He kept hooting and hollering, turning towards the direction they needed to go, and soon enough, Leo joined in, although without as much vigor. Eddie knew the man was scared. Hell, they were all scared. But he was going to have to pull his weight if they were going to get out of this. They tore across the gap of hallway and out into a more open area of the second floor. The outer shops were all fancy boutique stores, high-end jewelry shops, and the like, and the whole area was full of zombies. "Oh, fuck," Eddie breathed. "Quick on our feet," he thought, trying not to panic. "Need to think quick." They had to make noise, but they also had to not die, so he looked around frantically for somewhere they could do that. "They're coming!" Leo cried, looking behind them, and Eddie grabbed his wrist. "There!" he yelled. "The music store!" He pointed and began to run, tugging the middle-aged man behind him. Leo almost stumbled, but thankfully caught his footing because the yelling caused every single ghoul in the area to turn towards them. He ran with everything he had, pumping his legs until they screamed, and he was moving so fast that he realized too late that zombies were coming out of the music shop towards them. "Just run, just go," he thought, and lowered his shoulder, knocking between two of the ghouls and tearing into the shop proper. He could hear the thundering footsteps behind them and had to make a quick decision. They couldn't change course now, or they'd be overrun. "Into the back!" he yelled, though he was still dragging Leo behind him like a running ragdoll. He skirted the counter and burst into the back room, Leo stumbling in behind him and slammed the door, locking it with the deadbolt. Soon a wall of zombies smacked into it, some getting caught on the cashier's desk, others flying over it into the door and falling to the floor. But soon they converged on it, and the whole window was just a pile of rotting flesh and gnashing teeth. Leo cried out, and Eddie whipped around, crowbar held high. The older man grappled with a zombie with blood-matted dreadlocks down to its waist. They toppled over into a drum set, cymbals clashing loudly as Leo shrieked in fear, trying to hold the ghoul's mouth away from his own face. Eddie waffled, trying to line up his shot but afraid to accidentally hit Leo. "Get it already!" Leo grunted, and gave a great push, shoving the zombie up as far as he could. Eddie reacted, stabbing it in the temple, dropping it on top of his partner. Leo immediately shoved the corpse off of him, backing up along the floor like a crab and pressing himself against the far wall. "Are there any more?" he gasped. Eddie shook his head, looking around the open storeroom. It looked more like a jam room, a place where music lessons took place. Off to the side was a desk with a pretty impressive soundboard. Ignoring the pounding on the door for the time being, he approached the mixer, noting it was hooked up to a stereo. He cocked a brow and hit the power button on the stereo. Some soft, crooning piano music waved throughout the store, and he looked out at all the speakers lining the ceiling. "That's not going to do it," he murmured, and looked around for a stack of CDs or something, when he noticed a patch cord running from the mixer to a large amplifier. His eyebrows hit his hairline, and he grinned. "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" Leo moaned, pressing his hands to his head. "We're stuck in here." Eddie shook his head. "Our job is distraction, so distraction is what we're going to do," he explained as he picked up a bright red electric guitar and slung the strap over his shoulder. "Once they've done their job, they'll come get us." "Are you sure?" Leo babbled. "What if the others die and they just leave us in here?" Eddie shrugged as he plugged the patch cord into the guitar, pushing up the main slider on the mixer. "Then we're going down rockin'." Chapter 7. Grace reached the department store first, and her heart leapt into her throat at the sheer number of zombies inside. Even on the second floor, the place was packed. Why were there this many people in the mall before things were even open? Hawk slid up next to her, and they slid one of the doors closed, clicking the floor bolt down into place. This sent the ghouls into a frenzy, and they thundered towards them at full tilt. "Hurry!" Grace screamed, and Hawk pulled on the second half of their door, managing to get it shut just in time. She looked over at the second set of doors, expecting Allie and Joseph to be there, doing their job, but they were still catching up. Fuck, Grace thought, and tore for the other set of doors. The ghouls followed her, and Allie reached them just as she did, managing to throw both of their bodies into the doors just as the zombies crashed into them. "I can't," Joseph blubbered, and quickly turned tail, hurrying off towards the escalator.
"Get back here!"
Hawk cried as he pushed in next to Grace, trying to dig in his heels. Their shoes squeaked against the smooth tile floors, and the three of them breathed heavily, grunting as they tried to close the doors. "It's not working," Allie shrieked, her eyes wide with horror. A loud squeal echoed from the far side of the mall, followed by a series of rapid, distorted power cords. "We're not going to get these closed," Grace said, shaking her head. "We're going to have to make a run for it." Hawk swallowed hard as he tried to dig in harder, fingers starting to wiggle through the gap in the doors.
"We won't make it to the sporting store before they overwhelm us," he replied.
"If we go the opposite way, maybe they'll run towards the guitar noise, and we can hunker down and wait for them to be clear so we can close these doors," Grace suggested.
"That's a big maybe,"
Hawk groaned. Allie whimpered as her feet slid. "Make a decision," she urged. "On the count of 3, we let go and run for that cafe over there," Grace blurted quickly. "Ready? 1, 2, 3! The trio pushed off all at the same time, diving towards the little cafe at the end of the second-floor balcony. If they couldn't make it in, there was nowhere to go but down. It wasn't the best tactical decision, but it was a gamble they had to take, better than being trampled by zombies. As the doors flew open and ghouls poured out of the department store, some of them moved towards the guitar solo, but a good number of them took off after the fresh meal. Allie tripped over her own feet and fell face first onto the floor, smacking her face into the tiles. She screamed, and Hawk looked over his shoulder as zombies piled on top of her. Grace's blood ran cold at the sound of tearing flesh, but it didn't slow her down. The woman was gone, done like dinner, literally. As morbid as it was, Allie's gurgling body slowed down the bulk of the zombies chasing them, and they managed to skid into the empty cafe, dragging the plexiglass divider across its track and locking it. It bowed a bit as a quartet of creatures crashed into it, but held.
"Fuck,"
Hawk cursed, bringing a hand to his forehead. "We need to clear the back," Grace said, voice thick. She hadn't known Allie for very long, but it was still a tragedy when anyone died because of these stupid missions they were forced to complete. However, there was no time to mourn. They had to do their job so they could survive. Hawk nodded grimly, and they gripped their weapons, miraculously having held onto them during their battle with the doors.
"I don't hear anything,"
he said, but they stayed cautious as they approached the counter. "Me either," she replied, and when they reached the curtain for the back room, she strained her ears before hooking her finger in the edge of the fabric and pulling it aside. The back area was a small prep room, with 2 ovens built into the wall. A tray of muffins sat on the prep table, and Hawk approached them, relaxing once realizing they were truly alone. He poked one of the muffins and then knocked on top of it.
"Hard as a rock,"
he lamented, wrinkling his nose. Grace took a deep breath and pulled the walkie-talkie from her pocket, raising it to her lips. "No name, are you there?" she asked, and turned around, heading back out into the cafe proper to keep an eye on the front. Hawk followed her out and poked around behind the counter. He pulled a few levers and discovered the machine that spit out hot water, muttering under his breath as he pulled a few mugs down from one of the shelves. "Copy. What's your status?" No Name's voice came through the radio. Grace leaned on the counter as Hawk puttered around behind it and held the speaker to her mouth. "We couldn't get the doors closed," she reported. "Hawk and I are holed up in a cafe past the department store. I think Troy and Aaron are in the sporting goods store, and somebody from the decoy team is playing the electric guitar somewhere down the way. We can still hear it."
"That is not good," No Name said dryly. "What about the other 2 civilians that were with you?"
Grace rubbed her forehead. "Allie's dead. Joseph ran away as soon as we got to the doors," she sighed. "I don't know if he's alive or not. He ran towards the decoy team." No Name grunted on the other end with dissatisfaction.
"So the doors are still open, and all of you are trapped?" he asked. "Is that what you're telling me?"
"Maybe if we had proper preparation and a team that was actually trained to do this kind of shit, then I wouldn't have to tell you shit like this," she snarled. "Or, maybe if we weren't slaves to a—"
"That's enough," No Name cut in sharply. "Let me talk to some of the guys on the roof, and we'll see what we can do." Chapter 8. "Hey!" Troy cried as Joseph ran towards them, pumping his legs hard with what looked like a lot of effort. "Hey!" He fumbled with the lock on the metal gate, hoping he could get it open in time so that the man could come inside to safety. Joseph completely ignored them, spurred by fear, and ran past them towards the decoy team. "Is he stupid?" Aaron blurted, pressing his hands to his head. "The noise is where the zombies are gonna be." "Asshole coward," Troy snapped, shaking his head. "I'm not going out there and risking my neck to get him back." He turned to stare at the department store, where the others were struggling to hold the second set of doors shut. Before he could unlatch the grate to go and help them, they dove out of the way, letting the floodgates open. "Get back!" he hissed as the department store zombies tore towards them. He shoved Aaron around the corner from the metal gate, pressing them both against the wall. The ghouls thundered past, towards the still wailing guitar, and Troy peeked out, trying to see what was happening at the store. A woman's scream pierced the air, and he winced, spotting a cluster of ghouls bearing down on the floor. Guilt twisted his guts when relief washed over him that it was Allie, and not Grace, who'd fallen. The latter running for the cafe on the other side with Hawk. "Who was that?" Aaron moaned, sounding near tears. "What's going on out there?" "Shh," Troy replied. He wanted to make sure that the zombies eating Allie were going to steer clear of them. When they finished their meal, they took off towards the cafe instead of the guitar, slamming into the plexiglass barrier protecting Grace and Hawk. He sighed heavily at the sight of the department store door still open. Every once in a while a zombie would come tearing out, catching wind of noise from the mall. The zombies banging on the cafe were loud enough that 2 more headed that way, including Allie, as she reanimated, peeling her half-eaten corpse from the floor. "Allie's dead," he murmured, and Aaron took in a ragged breath behind them. "Hawk and Grace are trapped in the cafe." "We're fucked," he groaned. "What are we going to do now? They're just going to let us die in here, QXR bastards." Troy shook his head. "Just stay quiet," he instructed. "If we get an opening, we can go close the doors and then kill the zombies outside of the cafe." No way we're going to do that," Aaron argued shrilly. "They said there are hundreds of those things in that store. Our job was to secure this spot, and we did it, and that's all we're doing." Troy turned to him, eyes blazing. "How can you go from crying about us being left to die in here to standing by our job?" he hissed. "Clearly the plan didn't work, so we have to change it. Grace and Hawk aren't going to be able to get out of there by themselves, and we don't know how long Eddie and Leo are going to be able to keep up the distraction down there. Not to mention how screwed we'll all be if all of the hundreds of those things get into the mall and are drawn to that noise. If they get too packed in here, we'll really be trapped. We need to get those doors closed." "I'm staying right here," Aaron said, swallowing hard. "You realize if those of us that are useful die in here, and you're the only one left, they're just going to leave you in here, right?" Troy asked, voice low and menacing.
You realize that Grace is the only one who can get us out of this alive, right? No Name gave her a gun. You want to stick with her."
"She wasn't able to do her job," Aaron protested. "They're trapped too. What we should do is get down the escalator and back to the exit while all of the zombies are distracted."
Troy rolled his eyes. "Oh yeah? And those guys won't just shoot us as soon as we come out, huh?" he asked, poking the man in the chest. "If we walk out that door, tell them that we abandoned what we were supposed to do and left 4 able-bodied slaves in here to die instead of completing the mission, they're going to put bullets right into our foreheads." Aaron's resolve seemed to be slipping, but it was being quickly replaced by blind fear, and Troy was seriously starting to think there was no saving his team. He looked back towards the doors, trying to work out if he would be able to get there and shut them on his own. He figured he probably could, and get them shut, but he wouldn't be able to take out the ghouls at the cafe by himself. He'd have to run back to the sporting goods store and hunker down and regroup. But he wasn't sure if Aaron was the type of guy that would be so overcome with fear that he'd lock him out, especially if he had any zombies on his tail. He chewed his lip. If only he could talk to Grace, try to figure out the best course of action. If he could plan with her from the outside, so that they could help from the inside, they could probably take out the zombies outside of the cafe without Aaron's help. He grunted in frustration, ducking out of sight again as another pack of ghouls poured out of the store. There were too many ifs, and not enough solutions.
"Doesn't she have a radio?" Aaron suddenly said. "She's supposed to call for help once it's done, right? She's probably figuring something out right now."
Troy hated to admit it, but he had a sinking feeling that Aaron was right. She likely was relaying the information to No Name and figuring out what to do next. If he tried to play hero, which he really didn't want to do, then he might throw a wrench into whatever plan they'd have going on. He kept his eyes firmly locked on the cafe, waiting for some kind of signal, some kind of instructions. "Come on, girl, give us a sign." Chapter 9. "Grace, do you copy?" No Name asked through the radio. She and Hawk sat at the cafe bar, sipping some surprisingly delicious coffee he'd managed to make with one of the pour-over stations.
"I'm here," she said. "What have you got?"
"We've done some recon from the skylights on the roof," he replied. "There's a couple hundred zombies throughout the mall, with dozens still in the department store." Grace took a long, thoughtful sip of her hot brew.
"Wonderful," she said dryly. "So what's the plan?"
"We have the opposite problem now, where the bulk of the zombies are in the mall instead of the store," No Name explained. "So, same plan, but I'll need you on the other side of the locked doors, inside the store. You clear out in there, and then we'll do the fish-in-the-barrel routine from the other side." Hawk took a sip of his coffee, and then motioned to the barrier, where there were now 9 zombies, Allie included, pawing at the plexiglass.
"What about them?"
Grace nodded, bringing the radio to her lips again.
"We've got 9 of those things boxing us in here," she explained. "They don't seem to care about the decoy team's noise."
"There's an access panel just outside of the department store," No Name replied. "I'll get one of my men to shoot something loud to draw them away from you, so you can get into the store." She pursed her lips for a moment.
"How close to the doors?" she asked. "What if it draws a bunch of those things out to us?"
"Pick your moment," he replied. "There's nothing else close enough that it would make a difference." Hawk scoffed.
"No, of course not. You know there aren't a bunch of dudes with guns outside that could come in through the same door we did and help us or anything," he muttered.
"We'll try," Grace replied simply. "I suppose there's no place near wherever the decoy team is to shoot out the horde?"
"Negative," No Name replied. "That would be the easiest option, but there's no roof access there."
"Of course there isn't,"
Hawk said, shaking his head and downing the rest of his coffee. Grace sighed.
"Okay," she said into the walkie-talkie. "I'll report back soon, one way or the other."
She clicked off the radio before any reply, not wanting to hear his voice any more.
Regardless of him seeming more sympathetic than his comrades, he was still putting them through this, and she was sick of listening to his voice.
"So, this is fun,"
Hawk said, voice high in sarcasm. Grace nodded and drank the rest of the mug, smacking her lips together. "At least the brew was good," she said. "Thank you."
"Any time,"
he replied, and then got down from their stools. They approached the barrier slowly, sticking to the shadows. "I don't even know why they're still here," she whispered. "You'd think that after no movement for a while they'd have gone after the noise." Hawk shrugged.
"Maybe they can smell us in here," he suggested. "It's hard to imagine they have any kind of memory with dead brains. Like, do they remember that we came in here? Or have the mental capacity to know that we're trapped?"
"Don't know," she replied, and shook her head. It was unsettling to think about these things having any kind of thought process. But there wasn't any use ruminating on it. They were stuck in here, and 9 corpses needed to get out of their way before they could make a run for the doors. She wished they'd have been able to communicate with Troy. She could see the sporting goods store, and wondered if they were close enough that if they made a bunch of noise, the zombies would go their way. But again, these types of thought trains were useless. All she could do was hope that maybe he was watching, and would come out if they got into a grapple. There was the crack of gunfire and the ghouls snapped around, all save for 1. 8 of them took off, and Grace didn't waste any time. She threw the bolt and opened the barrier, lunging forward and swinging at the remaining zombie, dropping it to the floor. She took off for the doors, but the zombies were already disinterested in the gunfire. She'd been hoping that they would get all the way under that panel, so the mercenary above could take them out. But no such luck as they reared on her and Hawk. He nearly smashed into the back of her as she stopped short, preparing to sprint back to the coffee shop. "Hey-o!" somebody bellowed, and there was a clatter of metal as Troy darted out from the sporting goods store, a baseball bat in his hands. The zombies seemed confused for a moment, looking back and forth as if unsure which human would taste the best, and Grace took advantage of the situation. She lunged and stabbed at one that had its back turned closest to her, and then leapt back as the noise drew the attention of its partner. Hawk took care of that one, smashing it in the side of the skull with his weapon, and Troy let out another holler as he neared them. The 5 still standing ran for him, and Grace and Hawk tore after them, swinging hard. Troy's baseball bat connected with one's face, sending the body staggering back into its friends, and the back too fell with wet crunches as metal crushed their skulls. The final ghoul flailed around as the others fell on top of it, and Grace leaned forward, stabbing it in the face before it could get free. Aaron skidded up to them, clutching his tire iron with wide eyes. "Oh, you decided to join us," Troy drawled. "We have to get into the store," Grace urged, and took off for the doors, 3 teammates in tow. "Wait, inside?" Troy cried, though he followed her in. She and Hawk closed the doors, bolting them down, and then turned around to face the horde of hungry ghouls turning around to face them. Chapter 10. Grace dove to the right, slamming into a ghoul in a department store uniform, sending it over the railing to the first floor below. They were on a mezzanine, a store escalator in the center next to an elevator in a glass tube. The first floor crawled with zombies, but there were enough up where they were to be deadly. "We need to block the escalator," she cried. And it was true, but they were going to have to fight their way there. Hawk grabbed a rolling rack of clothes, swinging it around and letting it go to smack into a group of zombies running at him. They got tangled up and fell in a heap, the hangers clattering to the floor as the rack fell over. Troy followed his lead and thrust a second rack at Aaron, who was simply standing open-mouthed in fear. "Get your shit together," he barked. "We've got to fight." Grace flew past them to the wall, wrapping her fingers around a sturdy-looking shoe shelf. It was fastened to the wall, so she climbed it like a ladder until she balanced on top of it, pressed back against the wall. She pulled the handgun from the back of her pants, took aim at one of the ghouls closest to Hawk, and fired. The bullet hit its mark, and the noise caught the attention of the bulk of the creatures. They ran towards her, their fingertips just brushing the tops of the shelf. Shoes fell everywhere as they flailed for her, but she focused on the one still unperturbed by her. The trio of ghouls stuck under Hawk's rolling rack found their footing and launched towards Aaron. Grace fired 3 times, taking out 2 with headshots and hitting the 3rd in the shoulder. The cluster around her grew, drawing most of the zombies to the noise of the gun. "Block the escalator!" she screamed, as she spotted some ghouls attempting to get up the frozen stairs below. Despite their clumsiness, with enough flailing and determination, she didn't want to bank on them not being able to get up. Hawk and Troy brained 2 more ghouls near them, and then grabbed their rolling racks of doom, pulling them towards the escalators. Aaron staggered over to the railing, looking down to the floor, and Grace's blood boiled. She couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to put a bullet in his head, put him out of his misery. But she wasn't a murderer. Killing zombies was one thing. Killing a human was another. Of course, if he kept up this level of uselessness, it likely wouldn't be long before he was a zombie, and she'd have to put him down anyway. But they'd cross that bridge if and when they came to it. Hawk and Troy shoved rack after rack down the stairs, and the noise began to draw the back of Grace's group, easily now at 20 or so. She took aim and fired at one that was closest to the boys, dropping it and putting the heat back on her. A particularly tall zombie clawed at the tip of her shoe, and she grunted, kicking out and steadying her balance before swinging down with her crowbar to take it out. When the escalator was sufficiently full of metal and clothing, creating the most effective barrier they could build, Hawk and Troy turned back to her. "If you try to get them from the back, I'll keep drawing them back to me with the gun," Grace called, and they both nodded. Troy glanced over at Aaron, who was still clutching the railing, looking down at the sea of angry ghouls below. He stalked over and grabbed the man by the arm. "Get your ass in gear, or I'll throw you over myself," he snapped. Aaron clenched his jaw, defiance in his gaze, but it was laced in stone fear at the threat. He nodded jerkily, and they came to stand with Hawk. Grace fired again, at a zombie in the middle of the horde to make sure the falling body wouldn't draw attention to the back, and then the 3 men went to work. They darted forward, each smacking down a skull. Hawk managed to stab a second ghoul before jumping back, and Aaron and Troy retreated immediately as creatures whipped around. Grace was ready and aiming, and popped off 3 quick shots in succession, dropping 3 distracted zombies in the back. Another hand brushed her shoe, and she swung with her crowbar again. She overestimated her balance, and had a moment of panic where she thought she might topple right into the mini-horde. She windmilled her arms and pressed up on the balls of her feet, and her heart hammered in her chest as she regained her balance, pressing her back against the wall and breathing heavy. She steadied herself and watched Hawk, Troy, and Aaron lunge forward again, each taking down another ghoul. Once they leapt back into the clear, she popped off a few more shots, keeping her other hand firmly against the wall to keep herself grounded. Her aim was off a touch, and only 2 of the ghouls fell, but they were thinning the herd nicely. When they were down to 5, she holstered her gun, hoping that she hadn't wasted too many bullets that they'd need later. Hawk stabbed a ghoul in the face and then used the corpse to bowl over 2 other zombies. Grace shimmied until she was above him, and then dropped down behind him, darting around to lunge at one of the ghouls, trying to get the drop on Troy. Aaron swung wildly at his zombie, but his blow glanced off its neck, and it latched onto his arm. He screamed as it bit into his tricep, and tried to wrench his arm out of its teeth, to no avail. Grace moved towards him, but the zombies Hawk was wrestling with pulled away and tore for the easy meal. Between the 3 of them, they tackled Aaron to the floor, and his screams quickly turned to gurgles. "While they're distracted," Grace hissed, though her blood ran cold at the thought of it. Hadn't she thought about shooting Aaron? Hadn't she thought he wouldn't survive? and here he was, on the ground, being feasted on. The perfect distraction for destroying the threat. Her mouth tasted like bile. They rushed over, each stabbing down at a ghoul, and the bodies fell limp on top of Aaron. He was barely alive, his eyes rolling as his head lolled back and forth, blood pouring from his mouth and throat. Grace swallowed hard. "Sorry," she whispered, and then stabbed him in the eye socket with her crowbar. Chapter 11. The trio stepped back, tentatively relieved they'd survived this leg of the battle. The moans and groans and snarls echoing up from the first floor didn't do anything to comfort them, however, because the battle was far from over. "We need to clear this floor," Grace said, checking to make sure her gun and walkie-talkie were still there. Hawk nodded.
"I don't think there's anything else, considering all the noise we made," he pointed out, "but a sweep would be best."
They readied their weapons and headed past the escalator, glancing down to make sure that the pile-up of clothing racks was still doing their job. A few had dislodged at the bottom, but the ghouls hadn't made it even a quarter of the way up, so they were okay, for now. They wove their way through housewares and linens, making sure there were no more zombies hiding anywhere, which there didn't seem to be. When they came out the other side, they looked down off of the mezzanine to the terror below. There was a clatter as some of the rabid creatures pulled down a few more clothing racks, struggling beneath them but freeing up half of the escalators. "How many bullets do you have left?" Troy asked, though his tone betrayed that he knew the answer already. Grace shook her head. She didn't even need to look. "Not enough," she replied dryly. Hawk chewed his lip for a moment.
"That's not going to hold forever," he said. "What are we going to do here?"
"No chance our buddies outside can come in and mop this up?" Troy asked, wrinkling his nose. "Nope," Grace replied, shaking her head. "We gotta clear in here and then draw the mole zombies to us. Somehow," she sighed. "But that's later. What are we going to do now?" Hawk rubbed his forehead.
"I have an idea," he drawled, trailing off. "But I don't really like it."
"Spit it out," Troy said, waving a hand at him. Hawk motioned to the elevator.
"We've still got power. We could take the elevator down."
"They'd be on us as soon as the doors open," Grace replied, brow furrowing. "We'd be stuck."
"Not if we ride on top of the car," he replied, and then winced. "See? Don't like it."
But she had a thoughtful expression on her face. "It would work." "That's a very big elevator shaft," Troy mused. She nodded. "That's why you're going to stay up here," she said. "You stay at the top of the escalator. Make sure that the barricade holds, and Hawk and I will ride down and kill whatever ends up attracted by the doors opening. Once it's clear, we'll play cat and mouse like we did up here." He gaped at her. "Except with a lot more of those things," he protested. "And you'll have to make noise without a gun," she replied. "I think we might need it more downstairs, just in case." Troy shook his head. "Okay, girl. I don't have any other ideas," he admitted.
"I'll get prying on the ceiling panel,"
Hawk said, holding up his crowbar. The trio headed for the elevator, and Grace clapped Troy on the back as they passed by it to the escalators. "Cause enough of a ruckus, and we should be able to just take them all out from behind," she said. "I don't know. That's quite a group," he replied, shaking his head. "What do I do if they start getting too far up?" She glanced over her shoulder at a few shoe displays. "Toss whatever you can on top of them," she instructed. "Just try not to hit us." She cracked a small smile. "I'll do my best," he said, putting a hand on his chest. Grace jogged back over to Hawk, who was just pulling the ceiling door of the elevator open. The sliding doors began to close automatically, and she stuck out a hand to push them back. "Got it?" she asked, and he nodded.
"Yep, come here. I'll give you a boost,"
he replied, lacing his fingers together to make a step out of his hands. She shook her head. "How about I give you a boost?" she asked. "I think you can probably pull me up through that hole better than I can pull you."
"Fair enough,"
he replied, and moved over to the door open button, mashing on it as she took a position beneath the trapdoor. She laced her fingers together and then gave him a nod. Hawk stepped forward and put a foot in her hand, pushing off of the ground. Grace hauled up as hard as she could, and he reached up into the hole, grabbing the sides and pulling himself up. She darted over to the door and hit the button again to keep the doors open, just as they started to close, and then smashed the first floor button before darting back underneath the hole. Hawk's arm hung through, waiting, and she crouched as low as she could, leaping into the air. She managed to grasp his wrist, and he pulled her up enough with a grunt so she could grab the side of the hole, pulling herself up just as the doors gave a ding and closed, beginning the descent.
"How are we going to do this?" Hawk asked. "I know it was my idea, but depending on how many get in."
Grace shrugged. "We can try to stab them, and if that doesn't work, I'll shoot them until I run out of bullets," she replied. "Hopefully, I don't have to do that, and Troy can draw enough of them to the escalators."
"Guess we didn't think that far," Hawk muttered. "If they swarm over here, we're stuck in this elevator shaft."
She shook her head. "We can either climb, or Troy can push the elevator button for us," she replied, as the elevator reached the bottom floor. "But one thing at a time." The doors gave a ding and slid open. They watched through the glass shaft as 3 zombies tore towards them, slamming into the elevator, looking around, confused. Troy began to smack the metal racks with his crowbar, making a ruckus, and one of the ghouls took off, the rest on the bottom floor, converging on the escalators. The 2 in the elevator seemed at a loss, bumping into each other, and then bouncing off the walls of the small elevator. Grace pursed her lips. She didn't think she'd be able to reach low enough with her weapon to stab one, so they had to hope they'd just leave. After what felt like forever, the 2 zombies managed to bonk their way out the door, shoving each other to tear towards the escalator.
"We've got to hurry,"
Hawk murmured, motioning. The sheer amount of zombies tangled in the clothing racks was easily 30, and the flailing bodies continued to dislodge the haphazard barricade. Grace nodded and hung her legs into the hole, taking a deep breath before dropping down. She immediately ducked out of the way, pressing her back against the button panel, out of sight of the horde. Hawk came next and did the same, across the way on the other side of the elevator car. She pointed to him and then motioned to a makeup kiosk on his side of the store. He peered out and nodded, and she jerked her thumb over her shoulder to signal that she would go the other way. They made sure the coast was clear and then darted out of the elevator, each running off in their own direction. As soon as Grace cleared the elevator shaft, a duo of zombies appeared from behind a magazine display, surprising her. She ducked her shoulder and slammed into one, sending it flying backwards. She swung around immediately, burying her crowbar into the temple of the other one, and stopped long enough to stab the fallen ghoul before sprinting behind a larger shelf of magazines and stationery supplies. Chest heaving, she took stock of her surroundings, making sure there would be no surprises, and when she was sure her area was clear, she moved over to the other side so she could get a better view of the escalators. The zombies had managed to traverse about 2/3 of the stairs, and Troy was just toppling a large shelf over the top rack. It bounced off of a few ghouls and flattened a few more, skidding to a stop about 3/4 of the way down. Grace reached up and wiggled the shelf she stood behind, finding it flimsy and not bolted down. She took a deep breath and then let out a sharp whistle. As soon as a pack of zombies came running her way, she disappeared behind the shelf, and then gave it a shove, clambering up onto a foothold and holding on. The unit toppled forward, her body weight on top of it as it flattened a few bodies. She ran forward, light on her feet, keeping the unit pinning the ghouls beneath her. 2 that were just out of the way when it fell lunged for her, and she stabbed one, using it as a battering ram to shove the other back. As it fell beneath its friend, she jumped down and stabbed it through the eye before whipping around to deal with the pinned zombies. One head stuck out from beneath the shelf, so she got rid of it fast. But the others were writhing arms and legs, so she left them for the moment. A few more ghouls were hot on her tail, so she took off to dive behind another bookshelf, these deeper for full novels instead of magazines, running down one aisle, ducked down to stay out of sight. Troy banged his crowbar again, yelling and whooping, hopefully drawing the bulk of the ghouls back towards him. She wasn't sure how Hawk was faring, but she had to trust that he was pulling his weight. They needed to be a team here. Footsteps echoed behind her, and she whipped around, bringing her crowbar down on top of a zombie skull. It stumbled, and she smacked it again, cracking it this time. And as the corpse fell, another launched at her from right behind it. She kicked it in the chest, sending it back away from her, and then stabbed forward, killing it with an eye shot. When she emerged from the other side of the shelf, Troy was just sending another shoe rack down range, and it flattened a few more ghouls on the stairs on the left side. Grace crept along behind another bookshelf, and then soundlessly darted out to the back of the far left of the horde. She stabbed one in the very back, and then jumped back. Troy's voice was growing hoarse, but still loud enough to hold their attention and drown out the sound of falling bodies, so she lunged forward for another, picking off the zombies at the back. By the makeup counter, Hawk leapt over a pile of bodies he'd amassed in front of it, and crept quietly behind the horde on the right side. Between him and Grace, they began to fell corpses, and Troy upped his noise game to keep them as focused on him as he could. "Yeah! Fuck you! Fuck you! And especially fuck you!" he bellowed, brandishing a metal post from one of the racks, as well as his crowbar. He started to play a drum beat on one of the racks, and although he didn't have much rhythm, it was loud and did the trick. A zombie spun around and threw itself at Grace, and she instinctively ducked, sending it tripping over her and flopping to the floor. She dove to the side in case any of its friends decided to join it, and then circled around to stab it before it could get up. Before long, Hawk and Grace had taken care of all of the standing zombies, leaving only the ones crushed by racks and shelves. "Hang tight up there," she called to Troy, who gave her a little salute. "I need help with the magazine rack," she said to Hawk, motioning back towards the ghouls trying to slither out from beneath her fallen shelf. "Nice one," Hawk commended, and they strolled over to the rack, still running on adrenaline. One ghoul had managed to wriggle its way half out, and he dispatched it before kicking a leg sticking out beside it. "I pull, you stab?" he asked, and Grace nodded. He wrapped his hands around the flailing ankles and jerked, pulling the zombie clear. Grace stabbed it quickly, and then they turned back to the escalator, where a few pissed-off ghouls thrashed, tangled up in equipment. "Think it's safer to disentangle them, or climb up and stab through the racks?" Grace asked, and Hawk shrugged. "Either or is plenty unsafe," he replied, and she couldn't help but laugh. This was life now. She nodded and moved forward, climbing up onto the center median and shimmying up the escalator. She jabbed a few times through metal posts and clothes hangers, eventually catching the last animated zombie in the skull, ending the threat. Or at least, the immediate threat of the department store. "That went a lot better than I thought it was gonna," Troy called from the top, pressing a hand to his forehead. Grace nodded, letting out a deep breath. "Me too," she admitted. She slid down the median and hit the floor, waving for Hawk to follow her to the elevator. "Let's do a sweep and go back upstairs," she instructed, pulling the walkie-talkie from her pocket. "Job isn't over yet." Chapter 12. "Department store is secure," Grace said into the radio as she and Hawk stepped out of the elevator. There was a moment of silence before No Name came back. "Good. We have some finagling to do." "Finagling?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "The guitar is still going, and we need those zombies to come to the department store side," he explained. "So we're going to cut the power to that end of the mall, and when it stops, you can draw them all to your end so we can shoot them from the access panels." She took a deep breath. "Okay," she replied. "And what about the zombies on the bottom floor?" "We'll mop those up after we deal with the second floor," No Name replied. "And go and get Eddie and Leo, right?" Grace asked firmly. They're probably pretty pinned down over there.
Yes. Once we finish off the ones you can draw to you, we'll come in and take care of whatever is left on their end, No Name said.
She nodded. Okay. We'll cause a ruckus over here. Just make sure your guys are ready.
Done, came the reply, and then she shoved the walkie-talkie back in her pocket, leaving the volume up in case he needed to get back to her. Hawk swiped his palms together and slicked his sweaty hair back, having slid his crowbar into his belt loop once again.
Being stuck in the cafe was nicer. At least we had coffee, he said.
You guys got coffee? Troy asked, throwing his hands up. I miss all the best shit. It was really good coffee, too, Grace teased. Freshly brewed dark roast.
Stop, girl. You're making my mouth water, Troy replied, waving her off as they headed for the doors.
She sighed. I mean, I would much rather go for a latte, but it is what it is, she said wistfully.
Triple shot mochaccino,
Troy moaned, licking his lips.
Hawk rolled his eyes.
Listen to you both with your hipster drinks, he drawled.
Black coffee. Strong as hell. That's all you need.
Pumpkin spice with almond milk, extra foamy, Grace continued, ignoring him.
Short espresso with whipped cream on top, Troy added.
She nodded emphatically. Yeah. What's that called? A con panna? She asked, pointing at him.
So good.
Disgusting,
Hawk muttered.
As they reached the doors, enjoying their tiny bit of levity in the terrible situation, they could hear the guitar muffled in the distance.
I don't know if that's Eddie or Leo, but their fingers must be bleeding by now, Troy said.
Hawk shook his head.
Nah, that's some pro playing there. If they're that good, they've got calluses on their fingers the size of this mall, he pointed out.
All of a sudden, the music stopped, and the lights down the hallway went out.
Make some noise,
No Name's voice came through the radio, and the trio nodded at each other. Makes sense to open the doors and yell until they get close enough, right? Grace asked. And though the others looked reluctant to break their safe barrier, they knew she was right. Troy put a hand.
Let's all do one set, though, just in case, he suggested.
Good call,
Hawk agreed, and they moved to the right set of double doors.
You take one, I'll take the other, and Grace, you're on locking duty.
She nodded and knelt down, pulling up the deadbolts from the floor. Ready, she said, and they pushed open the doors. The boys began to holler, and Grace pulled her lip between her teeth, letting out one of her sharp whistles. She could see a square of light on the floor with a silhouette in it, and assumed it was one of the mercenaries up top at an access panel. Another square of light appeared next to it, and a second silhouette, which was comforting. At least they were there, ready. She just hoped the plan would work. Soon the footsteps thundered towards them, and they could see a horde tearing up the balcony towards the doors. They hollered until the zombies reached the sporting goods store, and then Hawk and Troy pulled the doors closed, and Grace locked them tightly. She grabbed the radio. Get ready, she barked into it, but the guys up top had already opened fire. Bullets sprayed the horde in full automatic fire, peppering their bodies into Swiss cheese. Those that didn't get hit in the head still fell backwards from the momentum of the shots, and the horde began to fall, bodies piling up and causing the ones behind to trip in a stumbling mass of death. Is that? Grace asked, squinting, staring out at a particular zombie flopping and twitching just on the other side of the doors.
It's Joseph,
Hawk replied, shaking his head. She wanted to say he shouldn't have run, but it didn't need to be said. They'd lost 3 today, and hopefully they wouldn't lose a 4th, or a 5th, or a 6th. It didn't take long for the mercenaries to plow through the mass of corpses, and soon there was nothing left but limp, bullet-ridden bodies in a heap.
If they have this much ammo, why do they insist on sending us into buildings with crowbars? Troy snapped, throwing his hands up. This is fucking absurd.
Grace shook her head. There was no time for this type of thinking. They had to get through this job.
It's a power trip,
Hawk said, drawing his bottom lip between his teeth.
That's all it is.
Grace lifted the radio to her lips. "Looks good. What now?" she asked. "We're going to come in from one of the roof access stairwells and go clean up wherever the decoy team is," No Name replied. "I'll need you three to come out and watch the escalator, make sure nothing is making its way up from the bottom floor." She nodded. "Got it," she said, and pocketed the radio again. "Crowbar's ready," she instructed. "I don't trust that all of these things are all dead." Hawk opened the door, weapon tightly in hand, and they carefully picked over the mountain of corpses, making sure nothing was still moving or moaning. Troy found one, stabbing it despite it being pinned by a ton of its brethren, but the rest were all still. The trio converged at the top of the escalator, and there were a few ghouls milling about at the bottom, but no other corpses to be seen from their vantage point. As gunfire echoed at the far end of the mall, Grace assumed the ones on the bottom floor were probably hanging out over there.
"So, we just wait?" Troy asked. "I like this."
Hawk rolled his eyes.
"Don't get too comfortable."
Chapter 13. As Eddie continued to shred the guitar, playing a crunchy rendition of one of his favorite classic rock tunes, two things happened at once. One, the power went out, killing his wicked solo, and the second was the distinct sound of shattering glass. "Stay clear of the door," he yelled, assuming that the glass breaking was the door window. The louder moans and snarls solidified this theory. "I can't see the door," Leo cried from somewhere behind him. "Then stay away from the sounds," Eddie called back, frantically scrambling for his crowbar. He didn't think any of the zombies could get in, especially through an opening so high off of the ground. But he didn't want to take chances. He needed to kill as many as he could to plug the hole in the door. "What are you doing?" Leo yelled as Eddie dropped the guitar with a crash. "I need to kill enough of these fuckers to barricade the door," he called back. "But how can you see what you're killing?" came the shrill question. "If you get bit and turn into one of those things, I'm boned." "Yeah, only you'll be boned," Eddie thought bitterly, but chose not to argue. His hand finally clasped around the crowbar, and he stood up, listening hard, willing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. But there was no adjusting to this. If the power was out, then the only light in the mall was from the sparse skylights in the center over the main walkway, not close to this store. Between the shadow of the deep store and the horde of zombies blocking the door, it was completely devoid of sight in there. He strained his ears as he moved, and then tripped over one of the fallen drums, cursing as he fell to his knees. However, it gave him an idea, and he picked up what he felt like a snare drum on a stand. He grabbed the metal base and then held it straight out in front of him, testing the darkness. It finally hit a wall and didn't move, which meant he wasn't poking the door. He moved to the left where he could hear the moans, and finally slid the drum over the seam of the doorframe. Something grabbed onto the side of the drum and it vibrated as hands smacked into it. He shoved it over a little more, lowering it until it felt like the ghouls were pushing down on it instead of the side. He braced his torso into the bottom of the stand and readied his crowbar. "Do I go with a swing or a jab?" Eddie thought, and then shook his head. Probably a jab would be best, hoping he hit ahead. "What are you doing?" Leo asked, closer now. "Don't get bit, man." "Shut up, I'm concentrating," Eddie muttered, and then froze at the sound of muffled gunfire. "What the hell?" Zombies shrieked from outside, and some pulled away from the window, casting a tiny bit of light on the situation. Eddie stepped back, lowering the drum. The gunfire was louder now that the window wasn't full of rotted flesh, and he moved out of the way to avoid catching a stray bullet. "Looks like the cavalry has arrived," he muttered, and if he were being honest, he hadn't expected it. He'd been certain that the QXR were going to leave him and Leo in this room to die. Hell, maybe they still would, and were just clearing out the last of the zombies. When the window was clear and the shots ceased, he carefully moved into the center of the room to peer out through the darkness. "You alive in there?" somebody barked. Eddie's shoulders sagged with relief. "Yeah, we're alive," he called. "Can we come out now?" "Come on out," the man replied. "Slowly." "Slowly?" he muttered under his breath. "Like we're robbing a bank or something?" Leo grabbed his arm. "I can't go out there," he hissed. "What?" Eddie replied, shaking his head. "We have to go out there. We don't have anywhere else to go, man." The man shook his head rapidly. "I can't." "Why the hell not? I know it sucks, man, but we've got to go back to our cells now," Eddie said. "Grab some food, get some sleep, and then do all this shit again tomorrow." Leo blinked rapidly, and then rolled up the sleeve of his plaid shirt, revealing a crimson bite in his forearm. "What the fuck?" Eddie blurted, eyes narrowing. "You had that this whole time? When the hell were you going to tell me? And you were all pissed about me getting too close to the door. Why?" "It happened when that thing had me in the drums," Leo hissed. "Get out of here," the mercenary outside bellowed. "We've got shit to do." "Stay in here then," Eddie replied. "I don't know what you want me to do about it." His partner shook his head rapidly. "They're going to kill me." "You're going to die anyway," Eddie shot back. And though his chest tightened in a mixture of sympathy and pity, he didn't know what he could possibly do about this situation. "It's your choice whether you want to die slowly in here, alone, or quick from a bullet. I can't make that choice for you, and I don't know what else you want me to say. I'm not going to stay in here and get eaten." Leo backed away from him, shaking. "Just tell them I'm already dead." "And risk them finding out I lied?" Eddie shook his head. "You know I can't do that, man. I know it sucks, but you have to own up to this." His partner crossed his arms. "I'm not going out there." "Hey!" the mercenary yelled, all semblance of patience gone. Eddie shrugged and headed for the door, opening it slowly. He raised his hands, still holding his crowbar, and moved out into the store. 3 mercenaries stood by the entrance, guns trained on him. "Where's the other guy?" one of them asked. Eddie glanced over his shoulder, not seeing Leo follow him. "He doesn't want to come out," he replied. "Does he need us to drag him out?" the mercenary snarled. "You ain't gonna like that, boy." For a second, Eddie wished that Leo was closer to death, so he could send these assholes into the room for a nasty surprise. But he shook it off. Nothing about this situation was good. He didn't want an innocent man to die because of these guys. He didn't want to be complicit in outing him for being bit. But the fact of the matter was, if they left him there, he was a danger to other innocents that would potentially be inhabiting this mall. "He's bit," he finally said, and 2 of the mercenaries immediately stormed forward, brushing past him into the back room. "No, no!" Leo screamed, and then 2 gunshots silenced him. Eddie's gut clenched hard, and he hung his head. He didn't feel good about this at all. Any elation he'd felt from his revisit to his guitar heyday evaporated. He also felt guilty for being so angry that the man hadn't said anything, and could have turned at any time while they were stuck in that room, killing them both. "You clear?" one of the mercenaries asked him, eyeing him carefully. "Did you even check him before you shot him?" Eddie asked through clenched teeth. The mercenary sneered at him. "He was holding up his bitten arm," he said, tapping the flashlight on the top of his gun. "Do I need to strip you to check?" "No, you can just take a look at me, asshole," Eddie muttered, holding up his hands higher so they could see his intact clothing. "He's clean," the other mercenary said, and then they ushered him out of the store. No Name approached them, pointing to a few off to the side and motioning for them to head back towards the department store. "Where's your teammate?" he asked. Eddie clenched his jaw. "He was bitten," he said. "We took care of it, sir," one of the mercenaries added, and No Name nodded, for a moment looking just exhausted. "Where are the others?" Eddie asked, tucking his crowbar into his belt buckle. "Are they okay?" "Your shipmates are the only ones to survive," No Name replied flatly. "Come on, we still have to clear out the main floor." Chapter 14. Grace straightened as No Name approached with Eddie in tow, but not Leo. Mercenaries lined the railing, firing sporadically down at the ghouls wandering around on the main floor. Thankfully, none of the ghouls had attempted to get up the escalator. so the trio had finally had a well-deserved break of it.
"Leo didn't make it?" Troy asked, voice tired.
Eddie simply shook his head as he joined them.
"I see you guys fared just as well," he replied.
"That was some kick-ass guitar playing, my man,"
Hawk piped up.
"Saved my ass," Troy added. "Thanks."
Eddie shrugged.
"Saw an opportunity."
"Stay sharp," No Name cut into their reunion, motioning to the ground floor. Grace rolled her eyes. The zombies didn't stand a chance against the mercenaries' guns, and they were easily taking out the few stragglers. "The stragglers from the hundreds that we dealt with for you," she thought bitterly, shaking her head. The quartet stayed quiet, standing vigil as the gunmen took out the last of the ghouls.
"Sweep them all,"
No Name barked, and men jogged towards him, heading down the escalator in a single file.
"Are we done then?"
Troy drawled.
"Or do we get to lead the men with assault rifles on their sweep, carrying crowbars?"
He held up his weapon to accentuate his point. No Name didn't meet his gaze. His jaw clenched hard. Grace watched him, noting his discomfort and his tired eyes. She knew it was dangerous to wonder if he would break and go against his masters, but she couldn't help it. Especially after such a long, draining day. It was difficult not to give in to such hopes. As the last of the men headed downstairs, No Name motioned for them to go.
"Let's get back outside through that maintenance tunnel," he said. "I'll drive us back to the ship."
They filed downstairs like good little lemmings and out into the fresh air. The mall had a stench to it, the stench of death. Grace wondered if any of these buildings would ever not smell like death ever again. After being packed full of corpses and blood, could it ever really wash away? They dumped their weapons into the bin by the van, and Grace reluctantly pulled out the gun and walkie-talkie, handing them back over to No Name. He checked the chamber and popped out the mag, blinking down at it in surprise.
"Bullets to spare," he said. "I'm impressed."
She shrugged. "I didn't want to waste any resources," she replied. "Only used it when I needed to." He nodded and opened the passenger door, motioning for her to climb up. Grace wrinkled her nose, not exactly excited about his act of chivalry, but decided she was too tired to argue, and climbed up into the passenger seat. He shut the door as the others got into the back of the van and skirted the hood to come around to the driver's seat. They rode in silence, and Grace couldn't help but ruminate on how, after such a short time, they'd already been trained like dogs. They did their job, gave their equipment back at the end of the day, and then rode back to their cells. Just that morning they'd accused their captors of being QXR canines. But here they were. She held on to the hope that it was okay for them because they had no choice. She side-glanced No Name. Did he really have a choice either? She knew it was dangerous thinking and mentally chastised herself, but it was possible that No Name, and maybe other mercenaries that were in the group, were just as much prisoners as they were. She shook her head. She didn't need to worry about anybody other than herself. She was the bottom of the food chain, and she needed to survive. For Dante. When they got back to the ship, they filed inside, feet dragging as the exhaustion really began to overtake them. No Name locked them up and then disappeared as they got comfortable, returning in a few moments with a tray of food.
"Mac and cheese?"
Troy raised an eyebrow as he took his bowl.
"What are we, college students?"
No Name glared at him.
"Would you rather have nothing?" "No, sir. Enroll me in a local class,"
Troy quipped, and took his bowl, digging in with fervor as he sat on his bed.
"Yet another delicacy that could be improved with hot sauce,"
Eddie declared as he took his bowl, and No Name took a step back to regard the quartet as they ate their meals.
"You four did a really great job today," he said.
Grace couldn't hold in her scoff.
"Got something to say?" he asked.
She licked her lips, setting down her fork. "It was a shit show in there," she said. "We were underprepared, and only half of our team survived."
"That's why I said you four did a great job," No Name explained. "I appreciate it."
Hawk scowled.
"Yeah, we really live for your appreciation."
"My appreciation keeps you alive another day,"
No Name snapped. But the words didn't hold as much venom as they could. He sighed. Rest up. Don't know where you'll be posted tomorrow. He turned around and left through the stairwell before any of them could retort back at him. That guy gives me a rash, Eddie said through a mouthful of cheesy noodles. Hawk nodded.
He's better than Mosley, at least, he replied.
Amen to that, Troy agreed, raising his fork in solidarity. Grace stayed quiet, chewing slowly, enjoying every bite of the boxed mac and cheese. It had been a favorite of hers when she was a little kid, and Dante made it for her often. At the time, she hadn't realized it was because it was cheap and they didn't have a lot of money. She just thought he was doing it because she liked it. Her heart clenched at the thought of him scraping pennies together to take care of her. So young. She couldn't help but wish for a world where he didn't have to take care of her anymore, where he could just move on and live his own life, a happy life.
So, where'd you learn to shred the guitar like that?
Hawk finally asked, regarding Eddie. The smaller man laughed, shaking his head. Used to play in a punk band when I was a teenager, he said. Twisted Carnage, we called ourselves. We were fucking terrible. The others laughed, even Grace, who couldn't suppress a chuckle. It was me and 5 guys, and all of us still lived with our parents, Eddie continued. Thing was, none of our parents wanted to listen to us making noise, so practicing in anyone's garage was out. We worked shitty fast food jobs and pooled our cash to rent out a storage container where we'd go to shred. Though I use the term practice loosely. Really, we just got stoned and made a ton of noise. Did you play gigs? Troy asked. There was one bar that used to hire us, and it was grungy as all hell, Eddie replied, chuckling and shaking his head. They had all the random shitty punk bands all the time, and the place was always full of a bunch of teens and early 20-somethings slamming into each other and busting the place up. I couldn't believe that place didn't get shut down for selling to minors.
How long has it been since you've played? Hawk asked. If it's been that long, your hands must be killing you shredding for so long in that store.
Oh, I still play, Eddie said, and then lowered his gaze. At least, I did, before the world went to shit. Had a nice setup in my basement at home, just to jam out after a hard day's work. What did you do? Grace asked, finding her voice. It felt good to talk about normal things, instead of strategizing how to not die. Factory dog, Eddie declared proudly. Camshafts. He waggled his eyebrows, and she rolled her eyes. What about you? He asked. CrossFit instructor, she replied, smirking.
Well, that explains a lot, Hawk said, cocking a smile.
And what about you? Grace asked, motioning to him. You a firefighter or something? He barked a laugh, shaking his head.
No, little lady. I'm most definitely not a firefighter, he replied. I was between jobs when this all went down, but before that, I was doing some carpentry work.
Nothing like the apocalypse to save us from unemployment, Eddie quipped as he polished off the rest of his food. What about you, Troy? You look like you were a stockbroker or something. Grace laughed, shaking her head. Investment banker, thank you, Troy replied haughtily. Eddie blinked at him. Isn't that's the same thing, right? He asked, looking between the other two. Not the same thing at all, Troy said, stabbing at his pasta with more force than was necessary. Okay, fancy pants, Eddie drawled, and set his bowl by the cell door, for whoever was going to pick it up later. Grace did the same, and soon all of them were finished, thoughtfully sipping on their water bottles. What do you think they'll have us do tomorrow? Eddie asked, as he stretched out on his bed. Maybe we'll get lucky and get to clear out a strip club.
Zombie strippers, man?
Hawk asked, shaking his head.
You are damaged.
Eddie shrugged. Just want to see all there is to see in this new world, he replied. Might as well take in all the local flavor. Grace shook her head as quiet fell over the group and curled up under her blankets, picking up the fluffy romance novel she'd grabbed from the basket in the corner. It was a ridiculous tale of a damsel in distress and the handsome duke that saved her.
but it was escapism, and that was what she needed, now more than ever. The end. Up next, when a squad of QXR mercenaries stumble across their location, Dante and Ace must take drastic measures to protect the others in Lowcountry, Part 6.